When you start your own business, I often recommend the legal form of a sole proprietorship. There is no separation here, and you don't need other people involved. And that's why the sole proprietorship is so relaxed, because it can be established quickly and is much less bureaucratic than, for example, a corporation. And if you are a sole proprietor, then your activity can be freelance or commercial. But the legal form is the sole proprietorship. And to register your self-employment, if you are engaged in commercial activities, you must register a business and register with the tax office. If you are a freelancer, then you can skip the business registration. And then you register directly with the tax office. I'm going to exclude the registration with insurance, any chambers, professional associations, and all that stuff here. I have recorded a step-by-step guide on becoming self-employed and starting a business, which I will link for you in the top right. But here, it's supposed to be about something else. Because in this context, a term and a question keep coming up, which I want to answer in this video. Namely, the question about the commercial register. Do you actually have to do that now? And we will answer this question in this video. First, let's clarify the question, what exactly is the commercial register? The commercial register is a public register of all companies in Germany. You can access it at handelsregister.de. And there you will find a list of all or almost all companies in Germany. And you will find the key data there. So, where is the headquarters? What does the company actually do? Who is the contact person, meaning the managing director, for example, and so on? And for larger companies, such as corporations, partnerships, but also for larger sole proprietorships, registration is mandatory. This means that if you, for example, establish a GmbH, you must definitely register in the commercial register. Your GmbH doesn't even exist if it is not registered there. The register is there to provide managing directors with a bit of security, so to speak, because you can check at any time who is actually behind it. Who am I actually speaking with here? Or put differently, is this person I'm speaking with even authorized to speak for this company? Small self-employed businesses, like small sole proprietorships, do not have to register in this commercial register. That's why not all companies are listed in this commercial register, but mainly the larger ones. And when I talk about large and small companies, I'm not referring to the small business regulation. So this is not about 25,000 euros in revenue. Unfortunately, the law does not provide any strict thresholds at which it becomes mandatory for you to register. However, you can assume that a large company generates a few €100,000 in revenue, possibly operates multiple branches or has employees who are active for your company. This means that if, as a sole proprietorship, you eventually generate $1 million in revenue, have 3 branches, and want to grant an employee the right to essentially conclude contracts for you, for your company, meaning you give them the right to speak on behalf of the company, then that is the point at which you must register in the commercial register. If this is not yet the case, then your sole proprietorship, your self-employment, your business is a small business. And you must not register in the commercial register. You can still do it, we'll get to that in a moment. It has a few advantages, but also a few disadvantages. But you can also, with €0 in revenue right at the start, actively decide to have yourself registered in this register. Freelancers need not register in the commercial register. You will not find freelancers in the commercial register. And with that, we come to the question, why should one actually do this? Let's assume I am, yes, somehow self-employed, I am a business owner, and I don't actually have to register in the commercial register because my business isn't large enough. However, I could do it, and it has a few advantages. And indeed, the most common advantage or the most common motivation for someone to do this is in the name. Because if you are operating as a sole proprietorship, then your business is named after you. So in my case, my business would then be called Melchior Neumann. And I can stand on my head and I can name my YouTube channel as a content creator, Tax Fit for Self-Employment. I can write Tax Fit everywhere, but legally my business is always called Melchior Neumann. And I must, of course, write this Melchior Neumann in my imprint, on my invoices, in my contracts, and everywhere else I write my company name. By the way, I have already recorded a separate video on the whole topic of company names, which I will link for you here in the top right. And as a sole proprietorship, you really only have one way to get rid of your real name. Namely, you register in the commercial register. And when you register in the commercial register, you can give yourself a fantasy name there. That means I could register as Steuerfit, or Steuerfit for self-employment in the commercial register. And then that is my official company name. But then, like with a GmbH, you have a small addition. My company would then be called, for example, Steuerfit, registered merchant, or you abbreviate the whole thing as EC. For women, it is then registered merchant. But the abbreviation is always EK. Somewhere also write owner Melchior Neumann. But the whole thing naturally appears more professional as a result. And I can, as a person in a certain way, at least in perception, step back into the second row. No matter where I go, they naturally perceive more that I now have a real company here and not just a freelance business. Sometimes when negotiating contracts with larger companies from abroad, they want to have an excerpt from the company register as proof that you are actually self-employed. And that's a bit problematic because this mandatory company register in Germany only exists in the form of the commercial register. This means if you happen to acquire a client who wants such proof and only wants this proof, then conversely, you need this registration to be able to acquire this client at all. But as I said, I had this situation only once in 15 years of self-employment. And after I told my client that there isn't such a mandatory register in Germany, he was fine with it. He was okay with me proving in other ways that I am truly self-employed. But that can happen. And those are generally the advantages you have when you register in the commercial register. But of course, the whole thing also has a few disadvantages, or rather, consequences. Because when you register there, it costs something initially. So this registration costs money. And you can't do it yourself. You have to do it through a notary. This means you have to make a notary appointment, and the notary can register you there. The name, the fictitious name, is registered, meaning your company name is registered. It also records who you are, where the headquarters is, and what your company actually does. Then it is listed in the commercial register. This costs some in court fees between 50 and 70 euros. And the notary, of course, also wants some money. He then adds another 200 or 300 euros to his bill. That means you generally have somehow costs amounting to 250 to 350 euros for being listed in there. Then you're listed there, you have to keep it up. That means if the core of your activity, i.e. the purpose of your company changes, then you have to update it. If you move, you have to update it there. And you simply have more tasks to keep everything up to date. If you are self-employed, you have to notify tax office and business registration. If registered in the commercial register, always consider it. The whole thing is of course not a huge effort, but you should at least not forget it. And another point, which should not be ignored, is the loss, at least the small loss of privacy. Because then the name is there and the address is also there, so the company HQ is in the commercial register. And if, for example, you run your home business, your home address is also listed in the commercial register. And if you don't want that, then you should think about it. And at this point, there is also a very common misconception and a myth that I would like to dispel. Namely, I keep hearing that the entry in the commercial register leads to a separation between oneself and the company and thus somehow provides a limitation of liability. If the company is doing poorly, then people can only go to the company and no longer to you, personally, to essentially collect their claims. And this doesn't exist in the legal form of a sole proprietorship. So this limitation of liability is absent for sole proprietorships. If your sole proprietorship is registered in the commercial register, that only exists with corporations. And that's why registering in the commercial register doesn't help you at all as a sole proprietorship. That means if you want this limitation of liability, then you should. Firstly, and this is the best way, deal with an insurance company. That means how can you actually cover potential financial damages that you might cause in the course of your activities? How can you exclude them through insurance? And you should think about the legal form. That means you could potentially just establish a GmbH. And with that, we come to the conclusion. Personally, I always consider voluntary registration in the commercial register to be superfluous. I do understand that it's appealing to be able to give yourself a fantasy name, but you can, even if your company is named after you, still give yourself brand names. That means your website can still be named as you would like to call it. You can write a large fantasy name in the logo on the advertising brochures and even on your invoice. Legally, however, a company is then named after you and this name must, of course, appear somewhere. In case of doubt, it is sufficient for your name to simply appear in the footer of the invoice. You don't have to register in the commercial register and subject yourself to these privacy restrictions and additional costs and obligations. In my opinion, that is not necessary at all. The only scenario where I would say, okay, I can understand is if you have such a large client that you could potentially acquire and you can only get them if you are registered, then it might be worth it. But ideally, you should include all these registration costs and the additional bureaucratic effort in the offer to this company. And if it is economically worthwhile, then you can go ahead with it. Otherwise, in most cases, I would simply say just leave it. Honestly, it's not worth the money and effort. If you have a different opinion or have questions, then feel free to let me know in the comments section and let's discuss it. If you are self-employed and need accounting software, bank account, tax fit, then check out my recommendations in the video description below. Or you can simply click right here. And now you could first subscribe to the channel and secondly watch another video, for example, this one or this one.